This year I've read 40 books and counting. I've read dense novels and short stories. I've read philosophical works and fictional westerns. I've read books that breathe new life into me and others that make me think, what the f***? The curse that inhabits my reading interests of philosophy and classic literature is that nearly every author I read is dead, and has been for a while now, so that means no new releases and no special podcast appearances. However, the blessing is that here in the 21st century, we've inherited over 2 millennia of written material, way more than anyone could ever hope to read in an entire lifetime. So as we close out this year, I wanted to share with you my top 6 books that I've read this year, and these are in no particular order. First on my list is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and I don't know how I'm going to try and attempt to summarize a 1,000+ page complicated book like this, but we're going to discuss it nonetheless. Everybody is identical in their secret unspoken belief that way deep down they are different from everyone else. David Foster Wallace is quite an interesting author. He has moments in this book and a lot of his writings where he's kind of showing off. He's using very complex vocabulary. He can be very long-winded or verbose, and it can be very tedious. At other times, he's absolutely hysterical. You're just laughing to yourself as you read this book. The characters have such deep, psychological depth to them. There's so many philosophical notes and takeaways and insights that you can get from reading this. There's just a lot going on. So to briefly describe the plot, because there is a plot to this book, there's kind of 3 different plots that converge towards the end. So you're following primarily Hal and Condenza, but this whole Incandenza family between Hal, Oren, and Mario, their 3 brothers, their father James, and their mother Avril. The second plot or group of characters you're following is Don Gately and Joelle Van Dyne and this in-it recovery house for addicts. And then the third plot line you're following is really this political battle or conspiracy going on between ONAN, which is the Organization of North Atlantic Treaties. In this world, America and Canada have kind of merged into one giant nation or organization. And then you have this anti-ONAN terrorist organization, which is these wheelchair assassins that are disseminating this film cartridge titled Infinite Jest, hence the title of the book. And the cartridge is so entertaining that once someone views it, they kind of become zombified, or like a vegetable, you can think of it, where they don't want to do anything else but watch this film. So it's kind of like it essentially kills the person because they become de facto vegetable. Now, as I kind of alluded to earlier, this book has so many different themes and character interactions going on and messages that Wallace is trying to relay that it's hard to put it all into one box. So I'm not going to try to. There's father and son dynamics going on. There's a lot of talk and discussion, especially around Don Gately and the recovery house, about substance abuse and addiction and depression and trauma. There's a whole lot of talk about suicide. And if you know anything about David Foster Wallace, of course, he committed suicide. He dealt with substance addiction. He dealt with depression for decades. And so you see a lot of his own personal experiences and traits and strifes put into the characters within this book. So it's not in any way a memoir or, a 1-to-1 ratio, but you can look back at it in a lot of ways of how he poured himself into these characters. You also see Hal Condenza in the whole tennis academy. It's because Wallace himself was very much a precocious child who was a bit of a tennis prodigy growing up and was very talented. And so, he centers around a lot of the story around things he obviously knows and can speak to with a lot of depth. This book is incredibly long. It's over 1,000 pages, and there's going to be trying times where you want to quit. But I promise you, if you stick through it, by the time you finish this book and flip that last page, you're going to want to read it again. And that's how I felt, and I've watched other reviews and people's thoughts on it, and that's how they felt. It's just, I think when you commit to such a long-term relationship with a book this big and dense, such a doorstopper, I think by the end you've spent so much time with these characters, you've really gotten in their head, and you feel like you're with tied within the story, and you kind of just you're disappointed and sad, I guess, when it ends. So this book filled me with a lot of intellectual insights, those beautiful quotes. They gave me a really good view or glimpse into what a depressive state looks like. It gives you those somber moments and scenes where you really get to walk in the shoes of someone who is clinically depressed or on, in the mental state of suicide. You also really get a glimpse into what, especially if you're like me and you haven't had substance abuse issues or addiction, you get a point of view that shares with you what that's really like, the severity of it, how AA and different groups and these kind of trite phrases we say, one day at a time, all of that, how it, despite its banality and how trite it can be, it has a lot of value to it and a lot of truth to it. There's a lot of truth to living in the moment, focusing on the present, taking it one day at a time. This book, I could say enough about it, or I couldn't say enough about it, I should say. There's so much to get to, and I will say it's not for everyone. There are some people that, maybe also love Dostoevsky like me, or like these different authors, and I mentioned this book and they kind of roll their eyes. It has a lot of pretentious qualities to it, a lot of pontification perhaps going on here that puts some people off the way that Wallace writes or articulates things and how wordy he can be. But for the people that do enjoy it, you'll absolutely love it. And the people that don't, I still think it's worth giving it a go, and it's worth finishing, because I think it's one of the greatest novels in recent history. Number 2 on my list is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to such a pass that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others. Dostoevsky is recognized as one of the greatest novelists of all time, so it's no surprise that one of his books and one of his most popular novels ended up on my list. At this point, I've been able to read 3 novels from Dostoevsky and 1 novella, and I think this one just stood out and shined above the others just a little bit more. I think it's primarily because the dynamic between the brothers, the different ideologies that they represent. I think the dynamism between different character relations and how they develop throughout the novel, as well as the adrenaline that I felt pumping in my veins during part 3 and 4 of this work, just cemented it on my list. So a little bit about the plot. You have 3 brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alexei, and you also have their deplorable father, Fyodor. There's other characters as well, but it really is centered around these 3, and they're the perspectives and point of views you get throughout the work. And each of them represent a different perspective or philosophy on life. Dmitri is very emotional. He's a bit of a profligate. He's very driven by his desires and passions. Then you have Ivan, who's, staunch rationalist and very logical to a fault, as you'll see. And then you have the youngest, Alexei, who is a man of God. He is faithful. He's driven by, love and faith in that way, and God, and he's guided very much by the elder Zosima. And he, at least in the earlier parts of the novel, he is working towards becoming a monk. So you see these different perspectives, how they shine. You see, as I mentioned, the tempestuous relationship between not only all the brothers, but how they relate to their father as well, who's a bit of a drunkard. He's not very loving, or doesn't take care of the brothers that very well. And actually you have this love triangle between the father, Dmitri, and this other woman, Agrafena or Grushenka. And so you have a love triangle, you have a murder occur, you have these 3 different brothers that are, evolving throughout the entire story and what they experience. And it is just, it's gripping. It's gripping. I've read Demons, read Crime and Punishment. All of those are beautiful masterpieces as well. But I think this book just gripped me from start to finish. The other ones I think take a little bit more time to build into, versus the Brothers Karamazov, I think start to finish, I was engaged. I mean, there's a beautiful interaction between the poem that Ivan writes, The Grand Inquisitor. There's a beautiful interaction between Ivan and the devil at the end, or a demon. And there's so many twists and turns, times where you're second guessing things, jaw-dropping moments. It's a really rewarding and enjoyable read. In this work, you also see a very complicated philosophical debate between Ivan and Alexei. Ivan being the rationalist and the atheist, questioning why does God allow suffering, and you get this interesting dynamic between love, freedom, free will, human suffering, the human condition. It's very fascinating, and obviously ties well to the existentialist or Nietzsche's discussion about freedom and suffering and all of that a lot as well. So you see that, and also I think one reason why people really love this novel specifically out of Dostoevsky's catalog is because it's easy to find attachment to one of the brothers, perhaps a little bit more than the others. Maybe you're more of a rationalist, maybe you're more of the sensualist, or maybe you are very faith-driven as well. And so you kind of attach yourself to one of these brothers, and throughout the novel, you see their faults, you see their errors, their flaws, and I think it's really helpful just to get all the different perspectives. So overall, easy recommendation, a safe recommendation, and just a beautiful book that I'm sure I'm going to read over and over. Third on my list is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Is life worth living? Why do we suffer? How do we find meaning in a meaningless and different world? Those are just a few of the questions explored by Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus. And I think this requires a little bit of context. So heading into the 20th century, we have the Age of Enlightenment and this push for science and rationalism that starts to put doubt into the religious community and religious sentiment overall in society. And society is starting to become more secularized, which is why Nietzsche proclaimed in his famous work in The Gay Science, God is dead. And what he meant by that, and why he said that, quote, we have killed him, is that through our push for rationalizing the world and trying to make sense of everything and our push for truth and certainty, we have cast a lot of doubt upon God. Well, what happens if you try and remove God or religious belief and faith from society? What happens to a secularized society? Well, it heads right into chaos and nihilism because people now don't have a divine purpose. They don't have some path that has been ordained by providence for them to follow. What is right and wrong if there's no objective divine morality telling you this is so? Thou shalt, all of those things. Now it becomes very subjective. Who is to say what is right or wrong? And this is explored very much with Nietzsche, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a preface to some of the questions that Camus was trying to answer. How do we find meaning in a world that is completely irrational? Nature is not moral. Nature does not follow any moral laws or codes that we humans create. So why do we suffer as humans? How do we justify the suffering? Because we can't rationalize it. What do we do with all this? And Camus' philosophy and what he expresses pretty well here in The Myth of Sisyphus is this concept of the absurd. And the absurd is that we seek to rationalize our suffering. We seek meaning in a meaningless world, in an irrational world that is completely indifferent to us. So because we have this innate desire as human beings and we're cast into this irrational world, that is the absurd. It is absurdity. Our existence overall is this state of absurdity. Now, with that in mind, how does Camus suggest that we don't commit suicide, that life is worth living? How do we find some sense of meaning? Well, a little bit of a different flavor or twist from his contemporaries of Sartre or any other existentialist is it goes a little bit beyond trying to create your own meaning, self-define it as an individual. What Camus suggests is that we embrace the absurd and continue to live in this state of revolt or defiance. We find enjoyment and meaning and value in the absurd, or in the rejection of the revolt of the absurd. And how he relates this, hence the name, is he relates it to the myth of Sisyphus, which if you aren't familiar from Greek mythology, Sisyphus has been condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. And as soon as he gets it near the top, the boulder rolls back down and he has to start the cycle again. And he ends the novel by suggesting that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So despite the meaninglessness of the nature, right, he's pushing this boulder up for eternity. He's constantly willing, per se, and pushing for no end goal. Yet Sisyphus can be happy because he has this purpose. He has this path. He has something that he's constantly pursuing or doing. So that's where Camus gets tied in with existentialism, is just the fixation rather on the path and the journey and embracing that absurdity, embracing our, let's say, pointless or meaningless existence, finding joy and happiness in life itself rather than hoping for some next life, rather than hoping for some afterlife or some greater purpose or some greater existence, appreciating and embracing the however absurd existence that we have here on earth in the now. So I really enjoy this work and Camus' philosophy overall. I find myself recommending this book to a lot of people because it's not too esoteric or out there that you need a ton of context to read if you're just getting into philosophy. And it's also very applicable to today's world. Society has become very secularized. And even if you do believe in a God, there are moments in your life where you do feel very dull and depressed and meaningless. And what this does is it kind of just reasserts that idea of embracing life for what it is, not trying to expect too much or tie ourselves to some transcendent purpose. And it can feel very grounding, I guess, is perhaps a way to put it. So I would recommend anyone kind of read this, especially if you are getting into existentialism or if you do feel a bit of that existential dread. I think we all do in modern day. Third on my list is The Gay Science by Friedrich Nietzsche. Either we have no dreams or our dreams are interesting. We should learn to arrange our waking life the same way. Nothing or interesting. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most influential philosophers in history, which is why last month I actually did a weekly series going over some of his most popular works, one of those being The Gay Science. Now, within this book, it's not all centered around one particular topic like Beyond Good and Evil and, let's say, On the Genealogy of Morals have at least more of a centralized focus. This book touches on a little bit of everything. You get primarily some of that iconoclastic rhetoric that Nietzsche is famous for, attacking Christianity, primarily the moral claims and prejudices that originate from it, less maybe the religion itself. And then you also see talk on the will to power, you see eternal recurrence, you see a lot of other discussions that I honestly wasn't expecting in here as well. He has two, because it's broken into 383 different sections. And in 5 books, 383 little sections. Some are short aphorisms, some are, multi-page kind of short essays, you could say. But there's 2 sections that I really like that discuss the idea of leisure and work and how we kind of persist ourselves. And we see this in today with this workaholic hustle culture where we work ourselves to death and we almost develop this bad conscience or this guilt when we have any leisure or free time. He says here on 259, even now one is ashamed of resting, and prolonged reflection almost gives people a bad conscience. One thinks with a watch in one's hand, and even as one eats one's midday meal while reading the latest news of the stock market, one lives as if one's always might miss out on something. So I feel like that exactly hits on today. But back to the kind of main overarching point is that famous scandalous claim, right, that God is dead. And I explore this a lot more in that video, so I'll link it perhaps up above. But the concept that God is dead is basically acknowledgement that society has become pushed and thrust forward through science, through rationalism, through this Enlightenment period. Now society has become secularized. We've lost our faith in God, and there's a lot of consequences to that. So this God is dead claim is not with a bunch of glee or really an optimistic claim. It's truly a more sorrowful or poignant claim that, man, now if we don't have this divine purpose, we lose the structure and community elements of religion. We lose the reliance upon God or the church. And this is very freeing. It can be very freeing to get away from the demands or constraints that church or religious faith and belief puts upon an individual. But there's a lot of consequences that come with that, particularly when it comes to morality. Even today, we still have this overarching moral belief system that's based upon Christianity or Judeo-Christian values. So Nietzsche explores all of that. You also see, like I mentioned, will to power discussed a lot, which is essentially Nietzsche's metaphysical claim, or how he gets really tied to existentialism in a lot of ways. So with the gay science, I found it to be very philosophically dense without being too tedious or convoluted like some philosophical treatises can be. Sometimes you're reading these and you want to fall asleep, or it gets too hard or confusing to trace. This book isn't that way, and there's a bunch of maxims in the middle here too that have a nice nice quips or clever remarks that are very applicable to life. So overall, I think this maybe isn't the perfect starting point to understand Nietzschean philosophy, but it's a great work to dive into, and it's very, I think, a critical read if you are trying to understand Nietzsche's overall philosophical view. Fifth on my list is Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea. Notes from Underground is a pivotal work to read, primarily because it's the launching point that Dostoevsky uses for all of his major novels that he had later in his life, including Demons, including The Brothers Karamazov, which we discussed earlier, including The Idiot and Crime and Punishment. And a lot of the characters, the psychological perspective, and some of the themes originate from this underground man that we listen to in this book. So we have this underground man. He's this very hyper-conscious is how he describes himself, man. He's very bitter. He's wicked, and he's wicked because he points out that, or he has this gripe essentially going on where, as we discussed with some of the previous works I recommended, society and in Russian culture at this time, there's this belief that if we can just rationalize everything, if we can just teach everyone to listen to reason, to act rationally, to do the right thing, then we can reach this utopian society. If we just organize society to be equal and rational, everything will work out, and we can remove ourselves from the barbaric relations and instincts that we have. But what the underground man points out, and Nietzsche does as well in some of his works, is that life and human nature and the human condition is far more complicated than that. We have these desires and emotions and passions, and these affects lead us to act irrationally. Even love, for example, is a very irrational emotion. Sometimes we love people that are very destructive for us, or we love something, let's say like an addiction, that is catastrophic for us, that is killing us. Yet we continue to do it. Why do we do that? Because we act irrationally. We still are very much driven by our instincts. As much as we think our consciousness can override all of that, it doesn't always do that. And sometimes, or oftentimes I should say, our consciousness is really just an organ that is justifying how we act in the subconscious. So it's really like an after the fact attempt by our consciousness to say, oh, I meant to do that, I chose that. So that's what Dostoevsky is really pointing out and articulating through this mouthpiece that is the underground man. The underground man talks about how there's this crystal palace, which is this utopian belief that we can have this rational world. Everyone should act from that point of reason. And the underground man says he wants to stick his tongue out at the crystal palace, and he wants to face suffering and experience it. And so it's a wonderful read. I found it very enlightening too, as a bit of an introvert, and I would describe myself in a way as hyper-conscious at times too, because the second half of the book, we see the interaction of the underground man earlier in his life with some of his peers and this other woman as well. And so we kind of see this psychological state that the character is experiencing, this bit of remorse or internal conflict with oneself going on. We see that here, and like I said, if you want to get into Dostoevsky's novels, this will make things make way more sense if you understand a little bit of where things are originating from and what philosophical and political movements are occurring in Russia during the 19th century. I think that's important to understand overall as well. So shorter read than all of his novels. That's also a good reason to start with this book. And lastly, on my list, probably the strangest book of them all, The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. These are my confessions, and if in them I say nothing, it's because I have nothing to say. This is probably the most odd yet unique book I have on my shelf. Fernando Pessoa is a Portuguese poet and writer from the early 20th century. He essentially lived mostly in the same city in Portugal his entire life. He was very introverted. He never married. I think he's believed to be a virgin his whole life. He was very secluded and isolated. And through that, we get some of the most beautiful, yet somber, yet depressing, yet enriching, and incredible writing from this individual. And the funny thing about this book and many of his others as well is this wasn't published in his lifetime. Unfortunately, like Kafka, like many other authors, he didn't receive any fame or admiration in his lifetime. It was only, I think it was 35 or 47 years after he had written a lot of this that they were discovered in this trunk. And within this trunk that I think was in the back of a car, they found all these writings that are compiled into the Book of Disquiet. So a bit of a miracle that we have it today. And I think it's important to have that context about the individual because you see it in, as I mentioned with David Foster Wallace, you see the traits and the experiences and the feelings and emotions of the author bleed directly into their writing, which seems quite obvious, but that's why it's just important to understand the author, their life, their context, as well as reading their work. So this book was incredible. I will say, as much as I gave it 5 stars, as much as it's on this list, one, it's not for everybody. It has this very sentiment of melancholy and nihilism or meaninglessness that kind of coats the overall work. So you're not going to read this and kind of walk away feeling peppy or very cheerful. Yet at the same time, it is food for the soul. If you are lonely, if you are introverted, if you are often, you find yourself in this state of melancholy like myself, this work will speak to you in ways that no other writer has before. It will remind you that you are not alone, that you are not the only one to experience some of this desire for loneliness and solitude, yet have this feeling of angst or like you're existing in an abyss. This book just works wonders. There's one section in here that is just so beautifully written that really articulates that feeling of being an introvert and not knowing how to kind of articulate or present yourself to others, not being capable of wearing the mask in public and presenting yourself in this fake way, having trouble being yourself in that way. And then the other note I wanted to say about this is that the whole thing isn't 5 stars, I'd say. The reason I gave it 5 stars and the reason why it's on this list is because maybe 20 to 25% of it is incredible. It's beautifully written poetry and prose. And like I said, for the reasons I just mentioned, it speaks to me and to many others in a very unique, peculiar way. Yet 40% of it is good and interesting. And then there's probably another 30 to 40% of it that I could kind of do without. It's a little bit slow. It's not bad, it's just a little bit slow. It is just under 500 pages, so it takes a little bit of a commitment to read, but like I said, for the people who it is for, it's truly incredible. And even for the people that maybe don't experience those emotions, I think there's still a ton to get out of this. And beautiful, like I said, just beautifully artistically written poems and prose that is very enriching. And the other big overarching theme within this book and within Pessoa's perspective on the world is this concept of dreaming, and not dreaming in the sleep state that we think of, but more he carries that concept of dreaming, daydreaming, imagination into all areas of life, into our existence. He kind of says that our subjective experience is what we make of it. So through the person who's really who can really leverage the capacity for dreaming, who's a very strong dreamer, who has a very vibrant, vivacious imagination, they're able to kind of deceive themselves in a state of happy delusion, perhaps is a way to put it. So I think a good way to think about it is this quote he has within the book where he says, "An expensive cigar and one's eyes closed, that's all it takes to be rich." And if you think about it, if we can just have this strong, vibrant imagination, and we can just have, let's say, a wine glass or an expensive cigar and close our eyes, we can imagine any existence. And he talks about this and a whole lot more, this concept of dreaming. It's very fascinating. It's very nuanced, I'd say. I don't hear it or see it that much in other philosophers, although if there are others, you can tell me in the comments. But that's another really important overarching theme. It's not all nihilistic or sad or contradictory or depressing in this book. I don't mean to make it sound like that. But it has themes that speak directly to the soul in a unique way. And for that reason, it made it on this list. That's it for this video. Those are the best 6 books I read in 2023. Let me know in the comments down below, what was your favorite book or favorite couple books that you read this year? What do you plan to read next year? What was your experiences or thoughts? If you read the same books as me, let me know. Like the video, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.